She lay motionless beneath a blanket of snow, her once auburn hair splayed across the frozen ground like spilled ink. The faint cloud of her breath, growing weaker with each exhale, was the only evidence that Abigail Mason still clung to life. One hand rested protectively over the roundness of her belly, where her unborn child stirred, seemingly oblivious to the peril they both faced. The other hand reached toward the distant horizon where, hours earlier, the last wagon of the Westfall expedition had disappeared, leaving nothing but wheel ruts rapidly filling with snow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November blizzard had swept across the plains without warning, transforming the golden Kansas prairie into a merciless white wasteland. As consciousness slipped from her grasp like water through fingers, Abigail glimpsed movement through frost-crusted eyelashes, a shadow against the blinding white. Approaching with silent, deliberate steps, a tall figure materialized through the veil of swirling snow, wrapped in layers of buffalo hide, face partially obscured by a leather hood. Dark, watchful eyes studied her from beneath it. A Comanche scout. In her last moments of awareness, Abigail registered neither fear nor hope, only the strange peace that comes with accepting one's fate. Then darkness claimed her. When awareness returned, it came in fragments. The crackle of fire, the smell of pine smoke, the weight of furs against her skin. For a moment, Abigail thought perhaps she'd dreamed it all. The wagon train, the banishment, the snow. But the ache in her bones and the hollow feeling in her chest told her otherwise. This was no dream. This was the aftermath of something terrible. And somehow she was still alive. The shelter was small but sturdy, a hunter's lodge built of timber and stone, nestled against the windward side of a rocky outcropping. She tried to rise but found her limbs uncooperative, heavy with exhaustion. "Be still." The voice came from the shadows, low, melodic, with the faintest hint of an accent. Storm not finished yet. Abigail turned her head toward the sound. The man sat cross-legged by the fire, hands busy with something she couldn't quite make out. He didn't look at her directly, affording her privacy even in this confined space. "Who?" Her voice cracked, throat parched from cold and fear. He rose in one fluid motion and brought a clay cup to her lips. Water, warm and tasting faintly of herbs. She drank greedily until he pulled it away. "Slowly," he cautioned. "Too much, you sick." She studied him now in the firelight. Younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30. His features were sharp, handsome in their severity. High cheekbones, straight nose, eyes like polished obsidian. His black hair was pulled back with a leather cord, revealing a jagged scar that ran from temple to jaw on the left side of his face. "My name is River," he said, answering her unspoken question. "Comanche scout. Sometimes hunt for army, sometimes just hunt." He gestured to the pelts hanging from the rafters. "I'm Abigail," she whispered. "Abigail Mason." He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. Why woman with child alone in snow? The question, so direct, brought everything flooding back. The whispers, the accusations, the cruel faces of people she'd once thought friends. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly. "They left me behind," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "The wagon train. They said I was—" The words caught in her throat. "They said I brought bad luck." River's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a familiar cruelty. "Rest now," he said, returning to his place by the fire. "Talk more when the storm ends." Abigail wanted to ask more, how far they were from the trail, whether he planned to take her to a settlement, what would happen to her child. But exhaustion pulled her under once more, and this time she didn't fight it. Silver Creek had never been kind to women like Abigail Mason. A mining town clinging to the eastern edge of Colorado Territory, it had little use for those who asked questions or challenged the natural order of things. And Abigail, with her books and her opinions, and her stubborn refusal to simply accept what she was told, had never quite fit. When she married Jacob Mason at 18, folks breathed a collective sigh of relief. Jacob, the town's promising young blacksmith, would surely tame that wild streak in her. For a time, it seemed they might be right. Abigail settled into the role of blacksmith's wife with as much grace as she could muster. She kept their modest home spotless, cooked hearty meals for Jacob's ravenous appetite. And if sometimes she stayed up late, reading by candlelight or sketching the birds that visited their yard, well, at least she did it behind closed doors. Then came the accident. A horseshoe not properly secured, a spooked stallion, and Jacob's skull crushed against the stone wall of his own forge. Just like that, Abigail was a widow at 23. The women of Silver Creek brought casseroles and sympathetic smiles. The men offered to fix her leaking roof or chop winter firewood. But beneath the Christian charity lay something darker, a wariness, as if Jacob's death hadn't been an accident at all, but some sort of retribution for Abigail's quiet defiance. She sold the forge and what she couldn't carry, using the money to buy passage with the Westfall expedition heading to Oregon Territory. A fresh start, she told herself. A place where no one knew her name or the whispers that followed it. The first weeks on the trail had been tolerable. She kept to herself, shared her supplies generously, and volunteered for extra shifts watching the children or mending clothes. If the other travelers found her reserved, they didn't seem to mind. Not at first. But as they pushed westward and the journey grew harder, the mood of the wagon train darkened. Food spoiled, wheels broke, a child fell ill with fever, and somehow Abigail found herself once again the object of sidelong glances and hushed conversations. It started with Martha Westfall, the expedition leader's wife, noticing Abigail's thickening waistline one afternoon as she hauled water from a creek. "When exactly did Jacob pass, Mrs. Mason?" she'd asked, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes cold as January. 6 months ago, Abigail had answered, her cheeks burning. Near the end of May, Martha's lips had tightened into a bloodless line. "And yet here you are, showing like a woman at least 4 months along." The implication hung in the air between them, clear as the autumn sky overhead. By sunset, the entire wagon train was buzzing with speculation. Some said she'd been carrying on with the undertaker even before Jacob's body was cold. Others whispered about Samuel Porter, the silver mine owner's son, who'd left town suddenly around the same time Abigail joined the expedition. The more pious among them suggested darker possibilities: witchcraft, demonic influence, or a pact with the devil himself. The truth was both simpler and more complicated. Jacob and Abigail had been trying for a baby since their wedding day. Month after month, year after year, hope blossomed and withered with each cycle of the moon. The night before the accident, Abigail had felt the telltale signs, the tenderness in her breasts, the strange metallic taste in her mouth, the inexplicable certainty that this time was different. But she'd held her tongue, unwilling to disappoint Jacob yet again if she was wrong. By the time she was certain, Jacob was 3 weeks in the ground, and Abigail was alone with a miracle no one would believe. The isolation grew more pronounced. As the miles stretched behind them, women clutched their children closer when she walked by. Men who had once tipped their hats now stared at the ground. Even the expedition's pastor, Reverend Thaddeus Walsh, refused to meet her eye during Sunday services. Only Eleanor Simmons, a widow twice Abigail's age traveling to live with her son in Portland, showed her any kindness. Eleanor slipped her extra portions of stew when no one was looking, shared her precious store of peppermint tea when Abigail's morning sickness was at its worst, and sometimes sat with her in the evenings, arthritic fingers busy with knitting. As they talked about everything and nothing, people fear what they don't understand, Eleanor told her one night as they watched the campfire die down to embers. "And a woman who survives without a man who might even thrive, that frightens them more than any ghost story." But even Eleanor's friendship couldn't shield Abigail from what was coming. As November arrived, with its biting winds and early snows, the expedition found itself dangerously behind schedule. The mountain passes would soon be impassable. Game grew scarce, tempers frayed like old rope. Then came the night that changed everything. Abigail had been sleeping fitfully, her growing belly making it difficult to find comfort on the hard ground when she was startled awake by firelight and faces looming over her. Reverend Walsh stood at the front, Bible clutched in one hand, his expression a mask of righteous determination. Behind him was Nathan Westfall, the expedition leader, looking uncomfortable but resolute, and Martha, wearing a nightcap and an expression of vindication. "Mrs. Mason," the Reverend intoned, his voice carrying in the quiet night, "it has come to our attention that you carry with you a burden of sin that threatens us all." Abigail scrambled to sit up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. "What are you talking about? Do not compound your transgressions with lies," Martha hissed. "We know what you are." In the firelight, Abigail could see other faces now, some grimly satisfied, others uncertain, a few openly distressed. Eleanor stood at the edge of the circle, her face pale with fear. "3 days ago, we lost 2 oxen to that creek crossing," Nathan Westfall said, his voice gruff. "Yesterday, the Miller boy nearly died when he fell from the wagon. This morning, we found a rattlesnake in the flour barrel. Signs, Mrs. Mason, signs that we harbor something unnatural among us." "That's superstitious nonsense," Abigail protested, but her voice wavered. She had seen the pattern forming, felt the noose of suspicion tightening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Reverend Walsh stepped forward, his shadow enormous in the dancing light. "Scripture teaches us that the wages of sin is death, but we are not savages. We offer you mercy, Abigail Mason. At first light, you will leave this expedition. There's a trading post some 20 miles back. If God wills it, you may find shelter. There." Abigail looked from face to face, searching for an ally, a voice of reason. Her eyes found Eleanor, who took a halting step forward. "This isn't right," the older woman began, but Martha cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Would you have us all perish before we reach the mountains? For the sake of one fallen woman?" Eleanor's shoulders slumped. She met Abigail's gaze with tears in her eyes, a silent apology. That night Abigail didn't sleep. She packed her meager belongings, tucking her journal into the inner pocket of her coat where it would stay dry. She counted her remaining coins. Enough, perhaps for a few nights' lodging if she reached the trading post. If at dawn, Nathan Westfall handed her a small sack of cornmeal and jerky. Not enough to sustain her for long, but better than nothing. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, held something like regret. "God be with you, Mrs. Mason," he muttered, then turned away. No one else spoke as she walked away from the circle of wagons. No one called out a farewell or wished her luck. Even Eleanor was nowhere to be seen, though Abigail later found an extra woolen scarf tucked into her pack, a final, secret kindness. She followed the trail back east for most of that day, moving slowly against the wind. The sky hung low and grey, promising snow. By mid-afternoon, the first flakes began to fall, fat and wet against her face. Still, she pushed on, one foot in front of the other, telling herself that the trading post couldn't be much farther. But as daylight faded and the snowfall intensified, Abigail was forced to admit a terrible truth. She had missed the turn to the trading post. The trail behind her was rapidly disappearing beneath a blanket of white. Ahead lay nothing but endless prairie and the growing darkness. And somewhere inside her, a child who depended on her to survive. She trudged on until her legs gave out, collapsing finally in the lee of a small rocky outcropping that offered minimal shelter from the wind. As consciousness began to slip away, Abigail thought she heard hoofbeats, saw a shadow moving through the storm toward her. Her last coherent thought was that perhaps death had come for her after all, wearing an unexpected face. Instead, it had been River who found her, tracking the wagon train as he often did when his hunting took him near the emigrant trails. He'd seen the confrontation from a distance, watched as they cast her out, and followed at a careful distance to see what would become of her. Now, as Abigail recovered slowly in his shelter, the storm continued to rage outside. Through the small window, she could see nothing but swirling white, hear nothing but the keening of the wind. She didn't know what awaited her when the snow cleared, whether River would help her reach a settlement, whether her child would survive, whether there was any place left in this vast country where a woman alone could make her way. But for now, she was alive. Her baby was alive. And in the quiet of the hunter's lodge, as River methodically repaired a pair of snowshoes and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, Abigail allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt since leaving Silver Creek. Hope. 3 days passed before the blizzard finally released its grip on the plains. Abigail woke to unfamiliar silence, the howling wind replaced by the soft drip of melting snow from the lodge's eaves. Pale sunlight streamed through the single window, casting a golden rectangle across the earthen floor. She pushed herself up to sitting, surprised at how much strength had returned to her limbs. The shelter was empty, but evidence of River's presence remained. A pot of something aromatic simmering over the banked fire, fresh kindling stacked neatly by the hearth, her clothes cleaned and laid out to dry on a rack of antlers mounted to the wall. Tentatively, Abigail swung her legs over the edge of the pallet. Her boots had been placed nearby, stuffed with dry grass to help them maintain their shape as they dried. Next to them sat a pair of moccasins, clearly made for feet larger than hers, but infinitely more practical than her sodden leather boots. She had just finished lacing them when the door swung open. River entered in a swirl of cold air, carrying an armful of fresh pine boughs. He paused when he saw her sitting up, a flicker of approval crossing his face. "You walked today," he stated, more observation than question. Abigail nodded. "Thanks to you." He shrugged, as if pulling a pregnant woman from certain death was a trivial matter, and set about arranging the pine boughs on the floor. Their sharp, resinous scent filled the lodge, masking the lingering smells of sickness and fear. "I need to know," Abigail said after a moment, "where exactly we are. How far from the trail? If there's a settlement nearby where I might—" "No settlement close," River interrupted, his back still to her as he worked. "Trading post 2 days' ride north. Army fort maybe 5 days south." He straightened and turned to face her. "But the snow is deep, trails covered, more storms are coming." He gestured towards her swollen belly. "Baby comes before you reach either place." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Abigail that had nothing to do with the winter air. She had known, of course, that her situation was precarious, but hearing it stated so plainly forced her to confront realities she'd been avoiding. "Then what am I to do?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. River studied her for a long moment. "Stay," he said finally, "until the baby comes, until the snow melts, then decide." The simplicity of his solution startled her. Stay, as if it were that easy. As if a Comanche scout and a white woman cast out from her own kind could simply coexist. "Why would you do that?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. In her experience, men rarely offered help without expecting something. In return, if River was offended by her tone, he didn't show it. Instead, he moved to the fire and stirred the contents of the pot. "Winter is time for stories," he said, seemingly changing the subject. My people say that to turn away one in need during the snow moon is to invite the same fate upon yourself. He ladled something into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. Besides, you are not first-person white people throw away. The stew was rich with game meat and wild onions. Abigail ate slowly, considering his words. There was no pity in them, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of a shared experience, being deemed disposable by those who claimed civilization. "I can work," she said between spoonfuls. "I'm not helpless. I can cook, sew, tend a fire." She gestured toward his buckskin shirt, where a tear was visible along one seam. "I can mend that for you." A hint of amusement touched River's eyes. "Good. Idle hands find trouble." Over the next few days, a cautious routine emerged. River would leave at dawn to check his traps or hunt, returning by midday with game or firewood. Abigail kept the lodge in order, prepared meals from his stores of dried corn and beans, supplemented with whatever meat he brought, and began repairing various items of clothing and equipment that had accumulated in his dwelling. They spoke little. At first, River was naturally taciturn, and Abigail was still wary, uncertain of her place in this strange arrangement. But gradually, as the days lengthened minutely toward winter solstice, the silence between them grew more comfortable. She learned that River had been educated at a mission school as a boy, which explained his facility with English. That he had scouted for the U.S. Army during campaigns against his own people, a choice that left him caught between two worlds, distrusted by whites, viewed as a traitor by many Comanche. That the scar on his face had come from his own brother during a raid that River had refused to join. "Why tell me all this?" Abigail asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her fingers busy with a pair of worn moccasins she was resoling. River poked at the embers with a stick, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "So you know who gives you shelter," he said. "No secrets, no lies." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Your turn now." And so Abigail told him her story, not the sanitized version she'd given the wagon train, but the whole truth. About her childhood as the daughter of a schoolteacher who'd encouraged her curiosity in a town that valued conformity. About Jacob, who'd loved her mind as much as her face, and whose death had left her adrift. About the child she carried, conceived in love during their last days together, a fact no one in Silver Creek or on the wagon train had believed. "They thought I was carrying another man's child," she concluded, her voice bitter. "Or worse, that something unnatural had happened, that I was cursed." River considered this, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "People fear what they don't understand," he said finally, unconsciously echoing Eleanor's words. "Woman without a man is like a wolf without a pack in their eyes. Dangerous." "And what do you see?" Abigail asked, surprising herself with her boldness. His answer was immediate. "Wolf still wolf, with pack or without. Still hunts, still survives." A rare smile touched his lips. "Still raises cubs." Something warm unfurled in Abigail's chest at his words. Not romantic feeling, but something equally powerful. Recognition. For the first time since Jacob's death, someone was seeing her clearly, not as a threat or a burden or an object of pity, but simply as a human being fighting to survive in a hostile world. That night, as snow began to fall again outside their shelter, Abigail realized that the lodge no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It felt, improbably, like the beginning of something new. December deepened, bringing shorter days and longer nights. The snow piled higher around the lodge, insulating it against the bitter cold, but also making travel increasingly difficult. River fashioned crude snowshoes for Abigail so she could walk short distances without sinking into the drifts, though her advancing pregnancy made her movements increasingly ungainly. They fell into rhythms neither had anticipated. In the evenings, River taught her to identify animal tracks and to read the weather in the patterns of clouds and stars. She taught him to read from her journal, his finger tracing the words haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. They played checkers with pieces carved from antler and wood on a board river, sketched in the dirt floor, and later transferred to a scrap of hide. The isolation should have been oppressive, but strangely, Abigail found herself more at peace than she had been in months. Here there were no accusing glances, no whispered rumors, just the honest work of survival and the quiet companionship of a man who asked nothing of her but what she freely offered. As Christmas approached, not that they would celebrate it formally, Abigail found herself humming carols as she worked, her spirits buoyed by the tiny movements of the child within her. Sometimes she caught River watching her, his expression thoughtful, as if trying to reconcile the vibrant woman before him with the half-frozen creature he'd rescued from the snow. Then came the day that shattered their fragile peace. River had gone to check a trapline, leaving Abigail with clear instructions not to venture beyond sight of the lodge. The morning was bright, the sun glinting off snow so brilliant it hurt the eyes. As she swept the threshold, something caught her attention. Movement. At the edge of the clearing, a flash of color against the white. Shading her eyes, Abigail peered into the distance. There, partially obscured by a stand of bare-branched cottonwoods, was what appeared to be a rider on horseback, then another, and a third. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Instinctively, she retreated inside the lodge, pressing her back against the door. Options raced through her mind. Hide, run, but where would she go, heavy with child and alone? Before she could decide, a voice called out, unmistakably white, unmistakably male. "Hello, the cabin. Anybody home?" Abigail's mouth went dry. Part of her wanted to remain silent, to pretend the lodge was empty. But smoke rose from the chimney, and fresh tracks marked the snow around the entrance. Whoever was out there already knew someone was inside. With trembling hands, she opened the door just wide enough to peer out. 3 men on horseback had entered the clearing. They wore the heavy wool coats and broad-brimmed hats of the U.S. cavalry, though they appeared to be scouts rather than regular soldiers. Their bearded faces were reddened by cold, their breath fogging in the clear air. "Well now," said the foremost rider, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard. "Didn't expect to find a white woman out here?" His eyes narrowed as they took in her condition. "You in some kind of trouble, ma'am?" Abigail hesitated. These men represented her surest chance of returning to civilization, to people of her own kind. Yet something held her back. Caution, yes, but also a strange reluctance to leave the safety she'd found with River. "I'm quite all right," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just waiting out the winter." The man exchanged glances with his companions. "Waiting it out? Here?" His tone made clear what he thought of that. "With who, if you don't mind?" "My asking? My husband will be back shortly," Abigail lied, the words tumbling out before she could consider them. "He's checking traps." "Your husband," the scout repeated slowly. "And he'd be a trapper," she said vaguely. "We're headed to Oregon come spring." The men didn't look convinced. The second rider, younger and clean-shaven except for a mustache, leaned forward in his saddle. "Ma'am, if you're being held against your will, you can tell us. We're scouts for the 7th Cavalry out of Fort Wallace. We can escort you back to safety." "I assure you, I'm here by choice," Abigail said more firmly this time. Her hand moved protectively to her belly. "We've simply chosen to wait until after the baby comes to continue our journey." The third man, silent until now, suddenly straightened in his saddle. "Say, Daniels," he said to the leader, "don't this place look familiar to you? Ain't this that Comanche Scouts hunting lodge, the one who sometimes works for Major Harrison?" Daniels' eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. "River!" he spat, as if the name itself left a foul taste. "This is his place, all right." His gaze returned to Abigail with new intensity. "Mom!" "Are you telling us you're married to that Indian?" The disgust in his voice kindled something fierce in Abigail's chest. "My arrangements are my own business, sir," she said coldly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." She made to close the door, but Daniels dismounted with surprising agility for his size and strode forward, his hand on the butt of his pistol. "I don't think you understand the situation. We can't in good conscience leave a white woman, especially in your condition, with a savage. It ain't Christian." "Step away from my door," Abigail said, fear and anger battling within her. "You have no right—" "We have every right to rescue a woman in distress," Daniels cut in. "Now pack whatever belongings you need. We're leaving before your husband returns." The younger scout had dismounted as well and was approaching the lodge, a rope in his hands as if preparing to secure her belongings, or perhaps her, to his saddle. "I am not leaving," Abigail said, gripping the doorframe for support. The child within her kicked vigorously, as if sensing her distress. Daniels nodded. To his companion, "Get her things, Jenkins. She'll thank us once she's back among decent folk." Jenkins stepped forward, but Abigail blocked the doorway. "Touch me or my belongings, and I swear to God, I will scream so loud they'll hear it all the way to Fort Wallace." "Now, ma'am?" Daniels began, his tone condescending. "There's no need for—" The distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the clearing. All heads turned toward the tree line, where River stood, his weapon trained steadily on Daniels' chest. He had approached with such silence that none of them had noticed his arrival. "Get away from my lodge," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the winter air. "Get away from her." The third scout fumbled for his own rifle, but River shifted, his aim slightly. "Do not touch gun. You will be dead before you clear leather." Daniel's face darkened with fury. "Well, if it isn't the turncoat himself. What kind of game are you playing, River? Taking white women captive now? How do you repay the army's trust?" "She is not captive," River replied evenly. "She is a guest, and you are trespassing." "Guest?" Daniels laughed harshly. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" His gaze flicked to Abigail's belly, then back to River, the implication clear. "The child is not his," Abigail said, before she could stop herself. "My husband died 6 months ago. River found me after I was abandoned by a wagon train." Daniels's expression shifted slightly, not to sympathy, but to something equally dangerous. "Understanding the Westfall expedition," he said slowly. "They reported losing a widow about a month back. Said she wandered off in a storm." His eyes narrowed. "Didn't mention she was in the family way, though." "They left me to die," Abigail said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "They cast me out because they decided my child was an abomination. A curse, because a woman alone frightened them." The scouts exchanged uneasy glances. Even men like these, hardened by frontier life, balked at the idea of abandoning a pregnant woman to the elements. "River saved my life," Abigail continued. "He's given me shelter, food, protection, asking nothing in return. So no, I will not be going with you. Not today, not ever." A tense silence fell over the clearing. River hadn't lowered his rifle, and the scouts remained poised for conflict, hands hovering near their weapons. Finally, Daniels spoke, addressing River directly. "Major Harrison won't like hearing you've got a white woman living with you." "Won't like it one bit. Major Harrison does not own me," River replied. "I scout when I choose, when the army pays fare. Rest of time, my life is my own. For now," Daniel said ominously. He turned back to Abigail. "Last chance, ma'am. Come with us now, or face the consequences when we return with a proper patrol." Abigail straightened as much as her condition allowed, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "I've already faced the worst consequence imaginable, being cast out by my own people to die. Whatever you bring back with you can hardly be worse." Something like grudging respect flickered in Daniel's eyes. He nodded once, sharply. "Your choice." "Ma'am, on your own head be it." He gestured to his companions. "Mount up, boys. We've got a long ride back to the fort." As they turned their horses, Daniels called back over his shoulder. "We'll be seeing you again, River. Count on it." Only when the scouts had disappeared beyond the tree line did River lower his rifle. He crossed the clearing to Abigail, who suddenly found her legs would no longer support her. She sank to her knees in the doorway, the delayed reaction to the confrontation hitting her all at once. River crouched beside her, one hand tentatively touching her shoulder. "You are unharmed." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "You could have gone with them," he said quietly. "Would be safer, easier." Abigail shook her head vehemently. "No," she finally managed. "Not safer, not easier. Just different. Dangers, different difficulties." She looked up at him, tears freezing on her lashes in the bitter cold. "You saved my life. I haven't forgotten that." "And now you save mine," he replied, his expression somber. "They would not have left without blood if you had not spoken." It was true, Abigail realized. Her presence, her words, had prevented violence. For the first time since Jacob's death, she had protected someone else instead of being the one who needed protection. River helped her inside, where the fire had burned low during the confrontation. As he built it back up, adding pine logs that filled the lodge with fragrant smoke, Abigail tried to process what had happened and what it meant for their future. "They'll come back," she said finally, "with more men, with orders." River nodded, face grim. "Yes, when snow melts. Maybe sooner if Daniels has a grudge." "Then we need to be ready," Abigail said, surprising herself with her resolve. "We need a plan." River turned to her, that rare hint of a smile touching his lips. "We," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, we make plan." He gestured to her, stomach. "But first baby comes, then we decide." As if on cue, a sharp pain lanced through Abigail's abdomen. She gasped, clutching at her belly as liquid soaked through her skirts. River's eyes widened in alarm. "Now, baby comes now?" Abigail nodded, breathless. I think my waters just broke." Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling from a sky the color of steel. The world beyond their clearing disappeared into whiteness, as if they were the only two people left in creation, and perhaps, for this moment at least, that was exactly what they needed to be. The labor lasted through the night and into the following day. Outside, the December storm raged, piling snow against the walls of the lodge until the windows were nearly covered. Inside, a different kind of storm broke, as Abigail's body fought to bring new life into the world. River proved surprisingly capable, heating water, preparing clean hides, and offering quiet encouragement as Abigail paced, then knelt, then finally lay on the pallet, gripping the edges until her knuckles turned white with each contraction. He confessed that he had assisted at births before, his sisters, his cousins, though never a white woman's. "Baby is baby," he said simply when Abigail questioned him. "Pain is pain, courage is courage." He placed a cool cloth on her forehead. "And you have much courage, Abigail Mason." She didn't feel courageous as the hours stretched endlessly, as the pain built to peaks she hadn't imagined possible. She cried, out for her mother long dead, for Jacob, even in her delirium, for Eleanor Simmons and her gentle arthritic hands. But when the final moments came, when River knelt between her legs and told her to push one last time, it was his eyes she sought. Steady, calm, believing in her strength even when her own faith faltered. "I see the head," he said, voice thick with some emotion she couldn't name. "One more time, Abigail, one more." She gathered her remaining strength, bore down with a guttural cry that tore from somewhere primal within her, and felt the sudden, miraculous release as her child slipped into the world and into River's waiting hands. "A daughter," he said softly. "You have a daughter." The infant's first cry pierced the air, thin, indignant, gloriously alive. River cleaned the tiny body with gentle efficiency, wrapped her in soft rabbit fur, and placed her on Abigail's chest. She was perfect, red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair plastered to her tiny skull and fingernails no bigger than pine needles. Abigail counted her fingers, her toes, marveling at the impossible miracle of her existence. "Hello, Clara," she whispered, the name she and Jacob had chosen years ago coming naturally to her lips. "Hello, my brave girl." River watched from a respectful distance, his usual stoicism softened by something like wonder. "She looks like you," he observed, "strong." Abigail looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, tears not of pain now, but of a joy so fierce it bordered on agony. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I would have died out there in the snow. We both would have." River shook his head. "You thank the river for flowing, the sun for rising." He turned away, suddenly awkward. "It is what must be done. Nothing more." But they both knew it was far more than that. The days that followed passed in the dreamy, exhausted haze that accompanies new motherhood. Abigail slept when Clara slept, nursed when Clara cried, and gradually began to regain her strength. River proved an unexpected ally in these early days, fashioning a cradle from a hollowed log lined with furs, bringing willow bark tea for Abigail's pain, watching over them both with quiet vigilance. January arrived with bitter cold and crystalline skies. The snow stopped falling, but what had already accumulated remained, transforming the landscape into a vast white sea, broken only by the dark silhouettes of trees. In this frozen world, their lodge became an island of warmth and new life. Clara thrived, her cheeks rounded, her crying grew more lusty, her dark eyes, so like Jacob's, began to track movement and light. Abigail found herself talking to her constantly, telling her stories of Silver Creek, of the father she would never know, of the strange journey that had brought them to this place. River listened to these one-sided conversations with interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed how little he knew about white customs and beliefs. Why did Abigail sing the same 5 songs to Clara every night? Why did she insist on washing the baby daily when Comanche children were oiled and wrapped until their umbilical stumps fell off? Why did she talk of baptism with such concern? These discussions filled the long winter evenings, bridging the cultural divide between them bit by bit. Abigail found herself fascinated by River's descriptions of Comanche child-rearing, how babies were strapped to cradle boards to strengthen their backs, how they were named for the first thing their mother saw after birth, how every child belonged, not just to its parents, but to the entire band. "Your people would call it savage," River said one night, watching as Abigail rocked Clara by the fire. "But savage just means different, means not bowing to your God or your ways." "I used to think I knew what savagery meant," Abigail replied softly, "but I've seen fine Christian men leave a woman and her unborn child to die in the snow. And I've seen a savage risk everything to save them." She met his eyes across the fire. "Perhaps we've all been using the wrong words." February brought a brief thaw. The snow receded enough that River could hunt more easily, bringing back a young deer that provided fresh meat after weeks of dried provisions. Abigail ventured outside with Clara, bundled against her chest, thrilling in the crisp air and pale sunshine after the confinement of her labor and recovery. But the thaw brought danger as well as relief. One morning, River returned from checking, his trapline with a grim expression. "Tracks," he said simply. "Horses, 6, maybe 7, cavalry." Abigail clutched Clara tighter. Daniels? River nodded. And others. They came from the south, headed north, not looking for us yet, just patrol. He stoked the fire higher. But they will come, when the weather breaks for good. They had discussed this possibility during the long winter nights. River had suggested taking Abigail and Clara to his mother's people, a small band of Comanche who had refused reservation and maintained a precarious independence in the eastern foothills. Abigail had countered with the idea of heading west once spring arrived, perhaps to one of the newer settlements in Washington Territory, where two strangers, even an unlikely pair like themselves, might blend in more easily. But Clara's arrival had complicated these plans. A newborn could not endure a long journey, especially not through winter mountains, and the cavalry scouts' appearance had shortened their timeline. "How long do we have?" Abigail asked, already mentally cataloguing their supplies, thinking of what they could carry, what they would need. River considered. 2 weeks, maybe less if warm weather holds. Not enough time. Not nearly enough. "We could fight," Abigail suggested, surprising herself with the thought. "This is your land, your home. They have no right—" "No." River's voice was firm. "Cannot fight the army. Not and live." He took a seat beside her, his eyes serious. "But there is another way." His plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than waiting for the cavalry to find them, they would go to Fort Wallace voluntarily. River would present Abigail and Clara as survivors he had rescued, fulfilling his duty as a scout. He would claim no connection beyond that of a good Samaritan. Once safely within the fort, Abigail could decide her next move, perhaps joining another wagon train in the spring, or finding employment in one of the settlements sprouting along the railroad. "And what of you?" Abigail asked. "What happens? Do you in this plan?" River shrugged. "I return to scouting, or go to my mother's people. Winter is nearly gone. I survive as always." The casual dismissal of their months together stung more than Abigail expected. After everything we've been through, we would just separate? As if none of this happened? "What happened is I found a woman in the snow. I did what any person with honor would do." River's face was carefully blank. "Now the woman is strong again, has child, needs her own kind." "My own kind left me to die," Abigail reminded him sharply. "My own kind called my child an abomination. Why would I want to return to them?" River's composure cracked slightly. "Because a child needs a future, needs school, medicine, other children. What can I give her here? Life of hiding, of shame?" He gestured around the lodge. "This is not enough for the daughter of Abigail Mason." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. What future could Clara have here, in this isolated lodge, with a mother rejected by her society, and a man who was neither her father nor, in the eyes of that society, an acceptable guardian? Even if Abigail were willing to cast her lot entirely, with River, and the thought had crossed her mind more often than she cared to admit, the world would never accept such a choice. "There must be another way," she insisted. But her voice lacked conviction. River's expression softened. "Sometimes there is no good path, only less bad one." They prepared for departure with heavy hearts. River fashioned a travois that could be pulled behind his horse, where Abigail and Clara could ride if the terrain became too difficult. Abigail sewed a new carrying sling for Clara from the softest deerskin, lined with rabbit fur. They packed dried meat, cornmeal, extra blankets, enough supplies to see them safely to the fort. The night before they planned to leave, a storm blew. In from the north, not snow this time, but rain, cold and relentless, turning the accumulated snow to treacherous slush. They delayed their departure, hoping for better conditions. The better conditions never came. Dawn broke with the distant sound of hoofbeats, not the usual forest noises, but the rhythmic approach of multiple riders. River was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle even as he motioned for Abigail to take Clara and move to the rear of the lodge. too late, he muttered. They found us. Through the lodge's single window, Abigail could see them, a mounted patrol of at least a dozen men approaching through the trees. At their head rode a figure she recognized, Daniels, his silver-streaked, beard now frosted with rain, his face set in grim determination. "Stay inside," River ordered. "Whatever happens, do not come out until I call for you." Before she could protest, he was gone, stepping outside to meet the approaching soldiers. Abigail clutched Clara to her chest, the baby mercifully quiet as if sensing the tension in her mother's body. Through the window, she watched the confrontation unfold. River stood tall in the clearing, his rifle held non-threateningly at his side as the patrol approached. Beside Daniels rode a man in an officer's uniform. Major Harrison, Abigail presumed, the one Daniels had threatened to report to. "River," the officer called, raising a hand to halt his men. "We've come for the woman and child." "They are well," River replied evenly. "I was bringing them to fort today. Storm delayed us," Daniels snorted audibly. "Convenient timing," the major ignored him. "Where are they now?" "Inside, resting." River gestured toward the lodge. "Child still young. Journey will be difficult." Major Harrison dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. He was younger than Abigail had expected, perhaps 35, with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes. "I'd like to see them," he said, "to assure myself of their condition." River hesitated, then nodded once. "I will bring them out." "But," Daniels interrupted, "begging your pardon, Major, but I wouldn't trust this Indian as far as I could throw him. He's been keeping a white woman in his lodge for months. God knows what's been happening in there." The Major frowned. "That's a serious accusation, Daniels." "It's the truth," Daniels insisted. "Ask any of the boys who were with me. She claimed to be his guest, but what kind of decent white woman chooses to live alone with a savage? She's either his captive or his—" "Enough," the Major cut him off sharply. "We'll determine the truth directly from the woman herself." He turned back to River. "Bring her out, please." Inside the lodge, Abigail had heard enough. With Clara secured in her sling, she straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and stepped outside before River could come for her. The clearing fell silent as she emerged. She was aware of the picture she presented, a white woman in a frontier, dress patched with buckskin, a child strapped to her chest, standing in the doorway of a Comanche hunting lodge. The soldiers' expressions ranged from shock to pity to undisguised contempt. Major Harrison recovered first. "Mrs. Mason?" he inquired, removing his hat. "I'm Major William Harrison, 7th Cavalry. We've come to escort you and your child to safety at Fort Wallace." Abigail descended the 2 crude steps to ground level, her chin high. "That's very kind of you, Major, but as I told your scouts when they visited some weeks ago, I am here by choice. River saved my life, and that of my child, when my own people abandoned me." Harrison's eyes flickered briefly to River, then back to Abigail. "Yes, I've heard something of your story from Mr. Daniels here. A wagon train, was it? The Westfall expedition?" "That's correct," Abigail confirmed. "They cast me out because they believed my child." She placed a protective hand on Clara's back and was conceived improperly, that I was somehow cursed or immoral because I was a pregnant widow. "And instead you found refuge with him," Harrison said, nodding toward River. "A fortunate coincidence." "There was nothing coincidental about it," Abigail replied steadily. "River tracked the wagon train, saw what happened to me, and made a conscious choice to help when no one else would. He delivered my child. He protected us through the winter. I owe him my life and more." Daniel spat into the mud. "See, Major, she's been turned, gone native. Probably thinks she's his squaw now." Anger flashed through Abigail. "I am no man's squaw, Mr. Daniels. I'm a free woman who has made her own choices. Choices your narrow mind apparently cannot comprehend." A ripple of surprise ran through the soldiers at her sharp retort. Major Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but a hint of respect entered his gaze. "Nevertheless, Mrs. Mason," he said after a moment, "Fort Wallace offers safety, medical care for your child, and the opportunity to connect with the next eastbound stage or westbound wagon train, depending on your preference. Surely you see the advantages." Abigail glanced at River, who stood silently watching the exchange, his face carefully neutral. This was, after all, the very plan they had been about to execute themselves, yet somehow having it forced upon them by armed men changed everything. "Before I make any decision," she said carefully, "I need certain assurances." Harrison tilted his head. "What kind of assurances?" "That River will not be punished for helping me, that his reputation as a scout will not be damaged by Mr. Daniels's insinuations, and that he will be free to come and go from the fort as he pleases, should he choose to accompany us there." Daniels made a noise of protest, but Harrison silenced him with a gesture. "Those are reasonable requests," the major said. "River has been a valuable scout for the army. His actions in rescuing you and your child speak to his character." He looked to River. "You're welcome to escort us back to the fort if that's your wish." River's eyes met Abigail's briefly, a silent communication born of months in close quarters. She gave him the slightest nod. "I will come," River said simply. The journey to Fort Wallace took 3 days through mud and intermittent rain. Abigail and Clara rode in a wagon the patrol had brought, while River scouted ahead or rode alongside, never far from them. The soldiers maintained a professional distance, though Abigail often caught them watching her with curiosity, or, in Daniel's case, barely concealed hostility. Major Harrison proved unexpectedly thoughtful, ensuring they stopped frequently for Abigail to tend to Clara and providing a tent for their privacy at night. During these rests, he sometimes engaged Abigail in conversation, asking about her life before Silver Creek, her education, her plans for the future. She answered carefully, revealing enough to establish herself as a respectable, educated woman, while avoiding any details that might reflect poorly on River. On the evening of the second day, as they camped by a swollen creek, Harrison sought her out as she sat nursing Clara beneath a canvas awning. "You know," he said without preamble, "there's a teaching position open at the fort. The previous schoolmaster returned east last month. His wife couldn't acclimate to frontier life." He studied her face. "It would provide you with lodging, a small stipend, and a place in the community. For you and your daughter." Abigail blinked in surprise. "You're offering me employment?" Harrison nodded. "You're clearly well-spoken, educated. Children at the fort need more than military drills and discipline. They need someone who can teach them about the wider world." A slight smile touched his lips. Someone who perhaps sees beyond the usual boundaries. The offer was tempting, far more so than Abigail had expected. A position of respect, independence, security for Clara. All the things River had said her daughter needed. "And what of River?" she asked. Harrison's expression grew carefully neutral. "As I said, he's welcome at the fort. His skills as a scout are valued. But," he hesitated, "the arrangement you had at the lodge would not be possible there." "You understand." Of course she understood. At the fort, River would be the Indian scout, tolerated, perhaps even respected for his abilities, but always separate. And she would be the school teacher, expected to maintain a certain propriety, especially as an unmarried mother already subject to gossip. The boundaries that had dissolved in the isolation of their winter sanctuary would reappear solid and unyielding in the structured world of the fort. "I'll consider your offer," Abigail said finally. "Thank you." Later that night, when the camp had quieted and Clara slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle, Abigail found River sitting apart from the others, watching the creek's swirling waters. "The major offered me a position," she said softly, settling beside him on a fallen log, "teaching the children at the fort." River nodded, unsurprised. Good. Respectable work. Safe place for Clara. And a cage, Abigail added, her voice barely audible above the rushing water. A different kind of cage than Silver Creek, but a cage nonetheless. River turned to look at her, his expression questioning. I've been thinking, she continued, about what you said, about there being no good path, only the less bad one. She drew a deep breath. But what if there's another path entirely? One we haven't considered. River waited, his silence an invitation for her to continue. What if we go neither to the fort nor back to the lodge? Abigail said, the idea taking shape as she spoke it. What if we travel west, as I originally planned? Not to a settlement, not to a reservation, but somewhere in between. Nowhere is in between, River replied, practical as always. Either white territory or Indian land. But there must be places, Abigail insisted, leaning forward. The territories are vast. There are valleys the army hasn't mapped, mountains where no settler has claimed land, places where we could build something new. River studied her face in the moonlight. We, he repeated, just as he had months ago in the lodge. You still say we. Yes, Abigail answered simply. We. Why? His question contained no judgment, only genuine curiosity. At Fort, you have position, respect, future for Clara. Abigail considered her words carefully. At the fort, I would have security, yes, but I would also have walls, not just the physical, stockade, but the invisible barriers of what's proper, what's expected. Clara would grow up learning that some people belong inside those walls and others don't. She shook her head. I've lived behind those kinds of walls my entire life, River. In Silver Creek, on the wagon train, always measuring my words, my actions, against what others deemed acceptable. And in winter, in lodge? River asked. No walls there? None that mattered, Abigail said softly. For the first time, I was just myself. Not a widow to be pitied, not a woman who asked too many questions, not a burden to be tolerated. Just Abigail. River was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the flowing water. Path you speak of is dangerous, he said finally. Hard living, no neighbors, no doctor when sick, no help if trouble comes. I know, Abigail acknowledged, but we've survived a winter alone already. We've delivered a child, hunted for food, kept warm and safe against all odds. She turned to face him fully. I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation, River. I'm afraid of going backward, of teaching Clara to live in a world divided by the same prejudices that nearly killed us both. And me? River asked, his voice unexpectedly vulnerable. What am I in this plan? Abigail hesitated, suddenly uncertain. She had assumed, perhaps unfairly, that River would want to come with them, that the connection forged during their winter together meant as much to him as it did to her. You would be whatever you choose to be, she said finally. A friend, a guide, a... She faltered, unable to find the right word for what he had become to her. Clara's life would be richer for having you in it, and so would mine. River's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle relaxing of shoulders that had been held rigid. I know place, he said after a long pause. West of here, 3 days' ride, valley between mountains, good water, good hunting, no settlers yet. His eyes met hers. No soldiers either. Hope flared in Abigail's chest. You would show me this place. I would help you build there, River corrected quietly, if that is truly what you want. It is, Abigail said without hesitation, for Clara, for myself. She paused, then added, for us. For the first time since she had known him, River smiled fully, a transformation that lightened his entire face, erasing years of caution and solitude. Then we find way, he said. Always there is way for those brave enough to make new path. They, planned in whispered conversations over the final day of travel to Fort Wallace. They would accept Major Harrison's hospitality temporarily, long enough to gather supplies, for Abigail to regain her full strength, and for Clara to grow a little sturdier for the journey. River would come and go as a scout, gathering intelligence about patrols and routes while caching supplies along their planned escape route. When spring was in full bloom, they would leave, not in the dead of night like fugitives, but simply failing to return from a sanctioned excursion. By the time anyone realized they weren't coming back, they would be well beyond pursuit. Fort Wallace appeared on the horizon late on the third day, a collection of weathered wooden buildings surrounded by a stockade fence, the American flag snapping in the wind above the central blockhouse. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, Abigail could make out figures moving in the yards, soldiers drilling, women hanging laundry, children darting between buildings. Civilization. Safety, confinement. Major Harrison reined his horse alongside the wagon. "Welcome to Fort Wallace, Mrs. Mason," he said with obvious pride. "Not the most elegant posting on the frontier, but we do our best to maintain certain standards." Abigail forced a smile. "It looks most impressive after a winter in the wilderness." "Major," as they approached the gates, Abigail felt River's presence behind her, solid, reassuring. He had ridden silently for most of the journey, keeping a careful distance from the soldiers while remaining close enough to watch over her and Clara. Now, as they prepared to enter a world where such proximity would be impossible, she found herself acutely aware of his every movement, every expression. The fort's inhabitants gathered to watch their arrival, curious faces peering from doorways and windows. Abigail felt their stares like physical touches, assessing, judging, categorizing. Woman, mother, widow. Already, the labels were attaching themselves to her, hardening like clay in a kiln. Major Harrison escorted her personally to the quarters. That would be hers. 2 small but clean rooms attached to the schoolhouse, simply furnished with a bed, a table, chairs, and a cradle that someone had thoughtfully provided. A young soldier's wife named Sarah was assigned to help her settle in, bringing hot water for washing, fresh clothing donated by the officers' wives, and a meal of real bread, stewed beef, and coffee that tasted like heaven after months of game, meat, and cornmeal. River disappeared into the barracks assigned to scouts and trackers at the edge of the fort. Before they parted, he had pressed something into Abigail's hand, a small pouch of soft leather containing a polished stone pendant. "On a braided cord. For Clara," he had murmured. "Protection." The gesture had brought tears to Abigail's eyes, both for its tenderness and for the public restraint that forced such moments into furtive exchanges. Her first week at Fort Wallace passed in a blur of introductions, adjustments, and cautious navigation of her new social position. The officers' wives called upon her, bearing gifts for the baby, and barely disguised curiosity about her time among the savages. Abigail answered their questions with careful half-truths, neither denying River's role in their survival, nor elaborating on the depth of the connection that had formed during those isolated months. Major Harrison formally offered her the teaching position, which she accepted with appropriate gratitude. The school would reopen after the spring thaw, he informed her, when the children could more easily travel from the scattered homesteads outside the fort's walls. In the meantime, she was welcome to prepare the classroom and familiarize herself with the available materials. Clara thrived in their new surroundings, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. The women of the fort cooed over her, knitted tiny garments for her, offered advice on colic and teething that Abigail accepted with grace, even when it contradicted what she had learned from River's people. No one asked about Clara's father, but Abigail volunteered the story of Jacob, edited for propriety, to establish her child's legitimacy beyond question. River kept his distance, as they had agreed. Occasionally, Abigail would glimpse him across the parade ground or returning with a hunting party, but their interactions were limited to brief nods of acknowledgement. Only once did he approach directly, when she was hanging laundry behind her. "Quarters with Clara sleeping nearby in a basket. All is well?" he asked quietly, his eyes darting to the baby and back to Abigail's face. "Yes," she replied, equally softly. "And your preparations?" "Progressing." His posture was stiff, formal, so different from the easy companionship they had shared in the lodge. "2 weeks more, I think, when dogwoods bloom." Abigail nodded, resisting the urge to reach out, to touch his arm, as she might have done without thinking during their winter together. "We'll be ready." He turned to go, then hesitated. "They treat you well?" "Well enough," she answered honestly. "They're curious, of course, and there are whispers." She shrugged. "But I've weathered worse gossip." River's expression darkened. "If anyone shows disrespect—" "No one has," Abigail assured him quickly. "Major Harrison has made it clear that I'm under his protection." Something flickered in River's eyes, a shadow of something like jealousy, perhaps, or concern. "Harrison is honorable man," he said after a moment. "For soldier." Before Abigail could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps forced them to step apart. Sarah appeared around the corner of the building, another basket of laundry in her arms. She faltered when she saw River, her eyes widening slightly. "Mrs. Mason," she stammered. "I didn't realize you had company." River stepped back, his face instantly impassive. "Just passing message from Major," he said smoothly. "Scout leaving tomorrow? Need to know if Mrs. Mason needs anything from trading post." Abigail picked up the fabrication seamlessly. "How thoughtful of the Major." "Please. Tell him I'm well supplied, but thank you." River nodded once and walked away, his stride purposeful. Sarah watched him go, then turned back to Abigail with poorly concealed curiosity. "The Comanche who found you," she said, arranging her features into an expression of sympathetic horror. "It must have been terrifying being at his mercy all those months." Abigail focused on pinning a tiny gown to the line, using the task to mask her reaction. "On the contrary," she said evenly, "I was never safer than in River's care. He treated me and my child with nothing but respect and kindness." Sarah looked skeptical. "Still," she persisted, "to be alone with an Indian. I don't know how you endured it." "The same way I endured being cast out by my own people to die in the snow," Abigail replied, an edge creeping into her voice despite her best efforts, with gratitude for the alternative. The conversation ended awkwardly, but the exchange crystallized. Something for Abigail. No matter how long she remained at Fort Wallace, no matter how well she performed her duties as teacher, no matter how respectable she appeared, she would always be the woman who had lived with a Comanche. That experience had marked her, changed her in ways that made her fundamentally different from Sarah and the other white women within the stockade walls, and perhaps that was not something to hide or regret, but to embrace. Spring advanced rapidly, the prairie awakening in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. True to River's prediction, the dogwoods burst into bloom in early April, their white flowers luminous against the greening landscape. Abigail packed discreetly, tucking small bundles of supplies into the bottom of Clara's cradle, sewing pockets into her skirts to hold essential items, trading some of her fort-provided clothing for more practical garments that would withstand hard travel. The morning they had chosen dawned clear and mild. Major Harrison had granted Abigail permission to take Clara on a short excursion beyond the fort's walls to sketch wildflowers for her classroom. River, ostensibly leaving on a 3-day scouting mission, would rendezvous with them at a predetermined location where he had already stashed horses and additional supplies. As Abigail prepared Clara for their journey, dressing her in layers that could be added or removed as needed, she was surprised by a knock at her door. She opened it to find Major Harrison standing on her threshold, hat in hand. "Mrs. Mason," he greeted her with a slight bow. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Major," Abigail replied. ushering him in while attempting to keep her anxiety from showing. Had he somehow discovered their plan? "What brings you here so early?" Harrison glanced around the small quarters, taking in the sketching materials laid out on the table, the basket packed with what appeared to be a simple picnic. "Lunch. I understand you're planning an excursion today." "Just a short one," Abigail confirmed, keeping her voice light. "I thought Clara would benefit from the fresh air, and I wanted to gather some specimens for the classroom." Harrison nodded, absently turning his hat in his hands. "A fine idea. The spring air is invigorating." He hesitated, then straightened, his shoulders as if coming to a decision. "I was wondering if you might permit me to accompany you." Abigail's heart sank. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to take you from your duties." "My duties can spare me for a morning," Harrison replied with a smile. "And I confess, I've been looking for an opportunity to speak with you privately, away from the curious ears of the fort." Alarm bells rang in Abigail's mind. If she refused him outright, it would raise suspicion. If she allowed him to join her, their escape plan would be ruined. She needed a third option. "Actually," she said, improvising rapidly, "I was planning to visit the creek just east of the fort, the one with the stand of cottonwoods." She had been there once before, in the opposite direction from their planned meeting point with River. "Clara has been fussy lately, and I thought the sound of running water might soothe her." Harrison's expression brightened. "An excellent choice. The wildflowers are particularly abundant there this time of year." He glanced at Clara, who was watching him with solemn eyes from her basket. "And I promise not to disturb the young lady's appreciation of nature with too much military conversation." "Trapped," Abigail forced a smile. "In that case, we would be delighted to have your company." The walk to the creek was pleasant enough, with Harrison carrying the basket and making light conversation about the spring planting, the expected arrival of new settlers, and his hopes for expanding the school once more. Families established homesteads in the area. Abigail responded appropriately, all while her mind raced with alternative plans. Could she somehow signal River that they needed to delay? Should she feign illness to cut the excursion short? At the creek, Harrison spread a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree and helped arrange their simple picnic. Clara, true to her resilient nature, charmed him with her gummy smiles and determined attempts to grasp his watch fob whenever it came within reach. "She has your spirit, Mrs. Mason," Harrison observed, gently disentangling his watch chain from Clara's tiny fingers. "Determined to claim whatever catches her interest." Something in his tone made Abigail look up sharply. Harrison was watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Major," she began, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "William," he corrected softly. "Please, at least here, away from the formalities of the fort." Abigail hesitated, then nodded. "William," he smiled, apparently encouraged. "Abigail, I'll come directly to the point. These past weeks, observing your courage, your intelligence, your devotion to your child, I've developed a profound admiration for you." He cleared his throat. "In fact, I believe my feelings have progressed beyond mere admiration." Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless. Of all the complications she had anticipated, this had not been among them. Harrison misinterpreted her silence as encouragement. "I know it's sudden," he continued earnestly, "and perhaps inappropriate given your recent bereavement, but life on the frontier has taught me the folly of delay when one's heart is engaged." He reached across the blanket to take her hand. "I'm offering you not just my affection, but my name, my protection, for you and for Clara." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. In another life, one where she hadn't spent a winter in River's Lodge, where she hadn't learned to see beyond the boundaries that had always constrained her, Abigail might have welcomed such an offer. Major William Harrison was everything society deemed desirable, educated, respected, financially secure. He could provide Clara with advantages that Abigail and River's uncertain future never could. Yet the thought of accepting him, of remaining within the fort's walls, of watching River ride away forever, it hollowed her out from the inside. "You honor me," she said finally, gently withdrawing her hand from his. "Truly. But I'm not free to accept your offer." Harrison's brow furrowed. "Is it too soon? I understand if you need time." "It isn't that," Abigail interrupted. "It's—" She took a deep breath, realizing that the moment had come for complete honesty, regardless of the consequences. "My heart is already engaged elsewhere." Understanding dawned slowly in Harrison's eyes. "The Scout," he said quietly. "River." Abigail nodded, bracing herself for disgust, for anger, for the judgment she had faced so many times before. Instead, Harrison was silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. "I suspected as much," he admitted finally. "There was something in the way you spoke of him, in the way he watched over you during our journey to the fort, something that went beyond the relationship of rescuer and rescued." "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly. "I never meant to mislead you." Harrison shook his head. "You didn't. I saw what I wanted to see, a woman of remarkable character in need of a protector." A wry smile touched his lips. "When in fact you had already found one far more suited to your spirit than I could ever be." Relief washed through Abigail, followed quickly by a new anxiety. "What happens now?" she asked cautiously. Harrison sighed, looking out over the creek's sparkling waters. "That depends," he said. "Were you planning to tell me about your intention? To leave with him today or simply disappear?" Abigail's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. "Don't look so alarmed," he said, his voice gentle. "I've commanded this fort for 3 years. Very little happens without my knowledge." He nodded toward the trees on the far bank, including a certain scout caching supplies and horses a half. "Day's ride from here. Are you going to stop us?" Abigail asked, her hand moving protectively to Clara's basket. Harrison considered this. "I should," he said thoughtfully. "It's my duty to protect white settlers, to maintain the boundaries between our people and the tribes, to uphold the social order." He met her eyes. "But I've seen what that social order did to you once already. Cast you out to die because you didn't conform to its expectations. And you won't do the same," Abigail finished for him, suddenly certain. "No," Harrison agreed. "I won't." He stood, brushing grass from his uniform trousers. "You have until sunset before I'm obliged to send a search party for a missing teacher and her infant, who failed to return from their approved excursion." Abigail rose as well, Clara cradled in her arms. "Why would you do this for us?" Harrison smiled sadly. "Because the frontier isn't just a place, Abigail. It's an idea, a meeting ground between what was and what might be. Sometimes the most important work happens not within the fort's walls, but out there, where different worlds collide and remake each other." He reached out to touch Clara's cheek gently. "And because this child deserves to grow up, knowing there's more than one way to be human." With that, he turned and began walking back toward the fort, leaving Abigail standing beneath the cottonwood tree, with tears streaming down her face, tears not of grief or fear, but of inexpressible gratitude for an unexpected ally. The valley, nestled between twin ridges of the Medicine Bow Mountains, sheltered from harsh winds and blessed with a clear, cold stream that sparkled in the summer sun. Pine forests clothed the upper slopes, giving way to meadows brilliant with wildflowers and rich with game. From the cabin built on a gentle rise overlooking the valley floor, Abigail could see for miles in every direction, could watch the seasons paint the landscape in ever-changing colors, could spot approaching riders long before they reached their doorstep. Not that riders came often, this place was deliberately chosen for its isolation, its distance from both white settlements and tribal territories. Here, in this in-between space, they had carved out something entirely their own. The cabin had grown over the 5 years since they first arrived, from a simple one-room shelter to a sturdy structure with separate sleeping quarters. A stone fireplace, glass windows brought in piece by piece from their infrequent trips to distant trading posts. Behind it stood a corral where River kept the horses he bred and trained, prized by both settlers and Indians for their speed and intelligence. A vegetable garden flourished in the rich soil, supplying them with food that Abigail preserved for winter using techniques learned from both her mother and River's people. Clara, now 6 years old, raced through the tall grass chasing butterflies, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner. She had Jacob's eyes and Abigail's determined chin, but her spirit was entirely her own, fearless, curious, at home in this wild place in a way neither of her parents had been at her age. She spoke English and Comanche with equal fluency, read from the books Abigail taught her from, and could also identify every medicinal plant River had shown her in the surrounding forest. Behind her toddled James, her 3-year-old brother, named for River's grandfather. His copper skin and straight black hair marked him clearly as River's son, just as his solemn demeanor and watchful eyes echoed his father's. Yet when he laughed, a rare but joyous sound, it transformed his entire face in a way that never failed. To make Abigail's heart swell with love, River emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing, a deer slung over his shoulders. He moved with the same fluid grace that had first caught Abigail's attention all those years ago, though the hardness in his face had softened with time and happiness. He deposited his kill by the outdoor fire pit, then straightened to survey. His domain, the home he had built, the family that had once seemed an impossible dream. His eyes found Abigail's across the distance, and the smile they shared required no words. They had forged this life together, step by step, creating their own rules, their own traditions, their own definitions of family and belonging. It hadn't been easy. The first winter in the valley had tested them sorely, with shelter half-built and supplies running low before the snows melted. There had been dangers, a grizzly bear that nearly killed River, a fever that left Clara delirious for days, a band of Cheyenne hunters who viewed their presence with initial suspicion until River's knowledge of their language and customs earned a wary acceptance. There had been arguments too, clashes of culture and expectation that sometimes left them sleeping on opposite sides of the cabin, stubbornly silent until necessity or love drove them back together. Abigail's insistence on teaching Clara to read had sparked one such disagreement, with River questioning the value of paper talking in a world where survival depended on more practical skills. But watching his daughter sound out her first words had changed his mind, and now he too participated in the evening lessons, his English reading improving alongside James's first attempts. Once a year, they made the journey to the nearest trading post, a hazardous trip that River initially undertook, alone, until Abigail insisted on accompanying him, unwilling to be separated for the week such travel required. There they exchanged River's exquisitely tanned hides and Abigail's medicinal preparations for coffee, sugar, ammunition, fabric, and most precious of all, books for Clara's education. At the trading post, Abigail sometimes heard news from the wider world, the continuing expansion of the railroads, new territories being organized, conflicts between settlers and tribes. Occasionally, she would pick up a newspaper, marveling at how distant and almost irrelevant the concerns of civilization now seemed. Once, 3 years earlier, they had encountered a cavalry patrol led by none other than Major William Harrison, promoted now to colonel. The meeting had been tense at first, with River instinctively positioning himself between the soldiers and his family. But Harrison had surprised them again with his discretion, officially recording the encounter as a meeting with independent settlers, rather than noting River's presence or their unusual family arrangement. Before departing, he had pressed a package into Abigail's hands, a primer for teaching reading, 3 slim volumes of poetry, and a letter penned in a familiar hand. Eleanor Simmons, the widow from the wagon train who had shown Abigail kindness when others turned away. She had eventually reached Oregon, the letter explained, and often thought of the young woman cast out in the snow. Harrison had promised to deliver the missive if his patrols ever crossed Abigail's path. "You were right to follow your heart," Eleanor had written. "In a world that offers women so few choices, you made one that was truly your own. I only wish I had found the courage to stand with you when it mattered." The words had brought Abigail to tears, not for what might have been, but for the validation of what was, this unconventional life she had chosen, this family she and River had created against all odds. Now, as the summer day waned and the shadows lengthened across their valley, Abigail called the children in for supper. Clara came running, James toddling determinedly in her wake. River joined them, wrapping an arm around Abigail's waist as they watched their children race toward home. "Happy?" he asked simply, the question he still posed occasionally, as if marveling that this life they had built could truly satisfy her. Abigail leaned into his embrace, remembering the desperate young widow collapsed in the snow, the woman who had lost everything yet somehow found a way to begin again. "More than happy," she answered, as she always did. "Free." And in that moment, as the sun gilded the mountains and their children's laughter echoed across the valley, Abigail Mason, once cast out, once abandoned, once deemed unworthy, knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home, not in Silver Creek, not at Fort Wallace, but here in this in-between place, with this remarkable man who had seen her value when no one else would. And these children who would grow up, knowing that the strongest boundaries were those they chose for themselves. The life they had created wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was authentically, genuinely theirs, a new path carved through wilderness, both physical and social. And in the end, that had made all the difference. 10 years had passed since Abigail and River first made their home in the valley. What had begun as a desperate gamble, a refusal to accept the limited choices society offered, had blossomed into something neither could have imagined in those early days of uncertainty. The valley that had once felt so isolated now buzzed with purposeful activity. Not with crowds or settlements, they had carefully preserved their privacy, but with the vibrant life they had cultivated in this sacred space between worlds. Clara, now 11, had grown into a lanky girl, with her mother's auburn hair, and a confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and where she belonged. She could shoot a bow with deadly accuracy, read Shakespeare by firelight, and speak 3 languages, English, Comanche, and the smattering of Spanish she'd picked up from traders who occasionally passed through. Unlike children raised in towns or on reservations, Clara moved fluidly between cultures, taking what resonated from each while rejecting arbitrary limitations. 8-year-old James had developed into River's shadow, absorbing his father's tracking skills and quiet strength. Yet he also possessed Abigail's insatiable curiosity, peppering everyone with questions that probed beyond the surface of things. The boy could sit motionless for hours, observing a beaver dam or an ant colony, then return home to meticulously document his findings in the journal Abigail had sewn for him, and there was Emma, their surprise blessing who had arrived 3 winters ago, named for Abigail's grandmother. At 5, she was a force of nature, fearless, stubborn, and impossible to contain. With River's copper skin and Abigail's green eyes, she embodied the bridge they had built between their separate worlds. "She reminds me of you," River often told Abigail, with a mixture of pride and exasperation, as Emma challenged yet another boundary or asked yet another impossible question. The cabin had expanded again to accommodate their growing family, a new room for Clara, who had requested privacy as she approached womanhood, a workshop where River crafted his ingenious tools and hunting equipment, a small schoolroom where Abigail conducted daily lessons. The original structure remained the heart of their home, with its large hearth and the table River had built from a single massive pine, wide enough to seat not just their family, but the occasional visitors who found their way to this haven. Those visitors had increased over the years, though they remained carefully selective about who they welcomed. A Shoshone family displaced by expanding settlements had stayed with them one winter, teaching them new methods of preserving food in exchange for shelter. A botanist from Boston, guided to their valley by chance after becoming separated from a scientific expedition, had spent a month cataloguing the local flora, while River maintained a watchful eye on the unusual guest. Most significantly, a small band of mixed heritage families, partnerships like theirs that existed in the margins between cultures, had established their own homesteads on the far side of the valley. Close enough for mutual support in emergencies, distant enough to preserve each family's independence. Together, they had formed something rare on the frontier, a community defined not by race or origin, but by shared values and a commitment to living beyond artificial divisions. On this particular evening in late summer, Abigail sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the western ridge, a mending basket in her lap, though her hands were idle. River had taken James and Emma fishing at the stream, while Clara had retreated to her room with one of the new books acquired during their annual trading journey. The journey this year had been different. For the first time, they had ventured, not just to the isolated trading post that had been their lifeline, but to a proper town, risk that felt necessary as their children grew and their needs evolved. The town of Pine Creek was small, but significant enough to have a general store, a doctor, even a small lending library that had made Clara's eyes widen with wonder. They had gone prepared for hostility, for the sideways glances and harsh whispers that mixed families typically endured in such places. River had considered staying in the woods while Abigail conducted their business, a precaution they had taken in the early years. But something had shifted in the territories since they had withdrawn from that world. The completion of the transcontinental railroad, the influx of immigrants from diverse nations, the slow, painful evolution in relations between settlers and the native peoples, all had created spaces where their presence, while still unusual, no longer provoked the visceral rejection they had once faced. In Pine Creek, they had been met with curiosity rather than outright condemnation. The storekeeper had been businesslike, focused more on the quality of River's pelts than on the man who brought them. The doctor, an elderly woman who had trained in Philadelphia before seeking her fortune in the West, had examined the children with professional detachment, pronouncing them disgustingly healthy in a tone that suggested approval. Only once had there been tension when a bearded man outside the blacksmith's shop had spat at River's feet and muttered something about squaw men. Before either Abigail or River could respond, the blacksmith himself had emerged, towering and soot-covered. "You'll respect my customers, Jenkins, or you'll take your business elsewhere," the big man had rumbled. "Times are changing. Best you change with them." The moment had passed without further incident, but it had left Abigail thoughtful. The world beyond their valley was indeed changing, perhaps not as quickly or completely as one might hope, but changing nonetheless. The rigid boundaries that had once seemed impenetrable were developing hairline cracks, small openings through which new possibilities might emerge. Now, as twilight deepened and the first stars appeared, Abigail considered what these changes might mean for their children, Clara especially, would soon face decisions about her future. She was bright, curious about the wider world in a way that sometimes worried Abigail. Would their isolated valley be enough for her as she grew into womanhood? Would she long for education beyond what Abigail could provide, for experiences beyond the mountains that had sheltered and protected them? The sound of laughter interrupted her thoughts. River returning with James and Emma, their catch strung on a line between them. Emma raced ahead, her small legs pumping as she called out her triumph. "Mama, I caught the biggest one. Papa said it's because I have magic hands." Abigail set aside her mending to admire the impressive trout, making appropriate sounds of amazement as Emma recounted every detail of her fishing adventure. James, more reserved but equally pleased, offered technical clarifications to his sisters. Enthusiastic narrative. River hung back, watching the scene with the quiet satisfaction that had become his hallmark. In these moments, ordinary, domestic, filled with small joys, Abigail still sometimes caught a flash of wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe that this life belonged to him. Later, after the fish had been cleaned and cooked, after the children had been tucked into their beds with stories and kisses, Abigail and River sat by the dying fire. It was their ritual, this time together at day's end, a space to share thoughts that couldn't be spoken amid the bustle of family life. "You're worried," River observed, reading her expression as easily as he read animal tracks. "Since Pine Creek." Abigail smiled wryly. Even after all these years, his directness could still catch her off guard. "Not worried exactly, just thinking about the future, about what our children will want as they grow." River nodded, understanding immediately. "Clara. She has so much potential, River. Sometimes I watch her reading or solving a mathematical problem or explaining something to her siblings, and I think, in another life, she could have gone to university, become a teacher or a doctor, or in another life," River repeated softly, "she might never have been born, or might have grown up ashamed of her mother's choices." He took Abigail's hand, his calloused fingers familiar and comforting against her skin. "We cannot know what paths will open for her. We can only prepare her to choose wisely when they do." As always, his perspective centered her, reminded her of what truly mattered. They had never sought to confine their children to this valley forever. Rather, they had created a foundation, a place where Clara, James, and Emma could develop the strength and clarity to navigate a complex world without losing themselves in its contradictions. "I've been thinking," River continued after a moment, "perhaps next summer we could take Clara to Fort Collins. There is a school there. Not for her to stay," he added quickly, seeing Abigail's expression, "but to meet the teachers, to see what learning looks like beyond our cabin, to help her understand what choices she might have when the time comes." Abigail leaned against his shoulder, touched by his willingness to consider a future that must, in some ways, frighten him as much as it did her. "You continually surprise me, you know, just when I think I have you figured out." River's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "Good," he said simply. "Surprise keeps the heart young." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned, down to embers, each lost in private thoughts yet completely present with the other. This had been the unexpected gift of their union. Not just survival, not just family, but this profound companionship that had deepened with each passing year. They had built something that defied categorization, something that existed outside the neatly labeled boxes of the world they had left behind. "Do you ever regret it?" Abigail asked suddenly, giving voice to a question that occasionally still haunted her in quiet moments. "Choosing this life with me. You could have continued as a scout, maintained connections with your mother's people." River considered her question with his usual thoughtfulness. "I regret some things," he acknowledged. That my mother died before meeting her grandchildren. That my brother and I never reconciled. His hand found hers in the darkness. But choosing, you, this life we've made? Never. He rose, pulling her gently to her feet. Come, he said, leading her outside onto the porch. The night had deepened. The sky above their valley, a vast canopy of stars, undimmed by any artificial light. The silhouettes of the mountains surrounded them, solid and eternal against the starlit sky. Look, River said softly, gesturing toward the heavens. The stars don't ask which ground reflects their light. They don't shine differently on Comanche land or white settlements. His arm encircled her waist. They just are, as we just are. Abigail leaned into his embrace, understanding what he was telling her. They had transcended the artificial boundaries that others had tried to impose upon them. They had created something authentic in a world of rigid categories and expectations. And in doing so, they had given their children the most precious gift of all, the freedom to define themselves, to create their own constellations in the darkness. Whatever paths Clara, James, and Emma might choose in the years to come, they would carry this legacy within them, the knowledge that the most meaningful boundaries were not those drawn on maps or enforced by society, but those chosen with clear eyes and open hearts. The legacy of a pregnant woman cast out from a wagon train, and the Comanche scout who had found her in the snow, two souls who had refused to accept the limitations others placed upon them. As they stood together beneath the infinite sky, Abigail knew with bone-deep certainty that this love, this family, this life carved from wilderness and prejudice and sheer stubborn hope was the truest form of freedom either of them would ever know. And it was more than enough. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers, painting the valley in vibrant purples, yellows, and blues. 15 years had passed since Abigail and River had first claimed this place as their own, and the season of renewal always brought with it a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had built. Clara, now 16, stood at the edge of the property, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. She had grown into a striking young woman, tall and assured, with her mother's thoughtful nature and her stepfather's quiet strength. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, but nothing could diminish the intelligence that shone in her eyes, or the determination in the set of her jaw. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Abigail asked, coming to stand beside her daughter. Clara turned, surprise briefly crossing her features before she smiled. "How did you know what I was thinking?" "Because I recognize that look," Abigail replied softly. "I've seen it in my own reflection." She gestured toward the mountains. "You're wondering what lies beyond." Since their visit to Fort Collins the previous summer, Clara had been different, more thoughtful, more questioning. The school there had opened her eyes to possibilities beyond their valley. The teachers, particularly a sharp-minded woman mathematician, who had taken an immediate interest in Clara's aptitude for numbers, had planted seeds that had taken root in the girl's fertile imagination. "I've been offered a place," Clara said after a moment, her voice a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Miss Harrington wrote to say I could study with her starting this fall. She believes I could qualify for Oberlin College in a year or two." Though they had discussed this possibility for months, hearing it stated so plainly still sent a pang through Abigail's heart. Oberlin, all the way in Ohio, one of the few institutions that accepted female students. It might as well have been on the moon for how far it would take Clara from them. "Your father and I will support whatever you decide," Abigail said carefully, using the term Clara had always applied to River, despite knowing he wasn't her biological parent. "We've never wanted to cage you here." Clara's eyes filled unexpectedly, with tears. "That's what makes it so hard," she admitted. "If you had forbidden it, if you had insisted I stay, the choice would be simpler. I could rebel, could leave knowing I was breaking free. She gestured around them, at the home that had sheltered her entire life. "But you've never been my cage. You've been my wings." Abigail pulled her daughter into an embrace, feeling the young woman's shoulders shake with suppressed emotion. "Oh, my brave girl," she whispered into Clara's hair. "Don't you see? That's exactly why you can go. Because you're not running from anything, you're running toward the person you're meant to become." Later that evening, after the younger children had gone to bed, Abigail, River, and Clara sat around the kitchen table discussing practical arrangements. River had been quiet throughout the day, processing the news in his own way, but now he spoke with the deliberate clarity that was his. "Hallmark, you will need proper documents," he said, laying out a small leather pouch. From it he withdrew papers that Abigail hadn't seen in years: her original marriage certificate to Jacob, Clara's birth documentation that Abigail had carefully preserved, even through their escape from Fort Wallace. "The school will ask questions," River continued, "about your family, your education. We must have answers ready." Clara nodded, understanding the complexities of her situation. Though she had grown up in this unique household, she would now be entering a world where such arrangements were viewed with suspicion at best, condemnation at worst. "We'll say you were educated at home by your mother, who was a teacher," River said, referencing Abigail's brief tenure at Fort Wallace. "It's truth, just not the complete truth." "And if they ask about my father?" Clara inquired softly. River's expression remained steady, though Abigail could see the effort it cost him. "You tell them Jacob Mason died before you were born. That your mother raised you with help from extended family." His voice softened, also truth in its way. Clara reached across the table to take River's weathered hand in hers. "But you're the only father I've ever known," she said fiercely. "The only one who matters." Something in River's face eased at her words. "I will always be your father, Clara, no matter what names you use in that other world." The preparations consumed the summer. There were clothes to be sewn, proper dresses that would allow Clara to blend seamlessly into town life, rather than the practical buckskins and homespun she typically wore. There were books to be studied to ensure her knowledge matched what would be expected. There were endless discussions about the social customs she would encounter, the prejudices she might face, the values she must hold fast to even as she adapted to new surroundings. Through it all, 13-year-old James watched with confused resentment, unable to understand his sister's desire to leave their valley. "Why isn't this enough for her?" he demanded one evening, helping River repair a fence, while Clara and Abigail worked on yet another dress. "Why does she need their schools and their cities?" River continued his methodical work, giving his son time to process his emotions. "Your sister isn't rejecting our life," he said finally. "She's honoring the freedom we've given her to choose her own path." He straightened, looking James in the eye. "Just as you will choose yours when the time comes." "I won't leave, James," declared with the absolutism of youth. "This is where I belong." River nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. "Time will tell. For now, our job is to support Clara in her journey, even if we don't fully understand it." Emma, at 10, reacted differently to her sister's impending departure. Always the most adaptable of the three children, she threw herself into helping Clara prepare, peppering her with questions about what she would learn, what she would see, what adventures awaited her in the wider world. "Will you write to us?" she asked, perched on Clara's bed, as her sister packed the small trunk that would accompany her. "Will you tell me everything about the city and the school and the people?" "Every week," Clara promised, tucking a small carved horse that James had made into her belongings. "And someday, perhaps you'll come visit me?" Emma's eyes widened at the possibility. "Could I really?" Clara smiled, ruffling her sister's hair. "Why not? The world is changing, Emma. More doors are opening every day." The morning of Clara's departure dawned clear and cool, with the first hints of autumn coloring the highest peaks. River had arranged for a trusted friend from the neighboring homestead to accompany Clara as far as Fort Collins, where she would be met by Miss Harrington. The journey would take several days, first by horseback, then by stagecoach, and finally by the train that would carry her east to begin her new life. The family gathered in the yard, the moment they had been preparing for suddenly, painfully, real. James stood awkwardly, torn between his resentment at being left behind and his love for his sister. Emma clung to Clara's hand, her usual exuberance muted by the finality of the occasion. River stepped forward first, placing his hands on Clara's shoulders in the traditional manner of his people. "Remember who you are," he said quietly, "not just what the new world will see, but what lives in your heart." From around his neck he removed a small leather pouch, his medicine bundle, which Abigail had never seen him without in all their years together. "Take this," he said, placing it in Clara's hand. "So part of me goes with you." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she closed her fingers around the sacred object. "I'll keep it safe," she promised. "Always." James came next, thrusting a package wrapped in deerskin into his sister's hands. "I made you something," he muttered, looking at the ground, "so you don't forget us." Clara unwrapped it to find a small, exquisitely carved wooden box. Opening it, she discovered a compass. Not a manufactured one, but one James had crafted himself from materials found in their valley, its needle pointing unerringly north. "So you can always find your way home," he said, finally meeting her eyes. Clara hugged him fiercely, whispering something in his ear that made him stand straighter, his expression clearing. Emma's gift was simpler, a crown of braided wildflowers she placed on her sister's head with a solemn ceremony. "So you take some of the valley with you," she explained, "and remember that nowhere else will ever be as beautiful." Finally, Abigail stepped forward. She had struggled for weeks over what to give Clara, what token could possibly encapsulate all she wished for her daughter, all she hoped she would remember in the years ahead. In the end, she had chosen something that connected past to future in a continuous thread. "This was your grandmother's," she said, fastening a silver locket around Clara's neck. "My mother wore it until the day she died, then passed it to me." Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of Abigail as a young woman, alongside a more recent image of River with James and Emma. "So, no matter how far you travel, we're always close to your heart." As their final embrace stretched into minutes, Abigail whispered into her daughter's ear, "Remember, my brave girl, the walls that truly matter are the ones you build yourself. Choose them wisely." Then Clara was mounting her horse, arranging her skirts as River had taught her long ago, smiling through tears as she looked back at the only home she'd ever known. The morning sun caught the silver locket at her throat, sending a flash of light across the yard like a promise. "I'll be back," she called, her voice breaking slightly. "This isn't goodbye, it's just until next time." As they watched her ride, away, River's arm strong around Abigail's waist, Emma's small hand clutched in hers, James standing tall beside his father, Abigail felt an overwhelming sense of completion. The circle that had begun that snowy day when River found her abandoned and dying had expanded to include these children, this home, this life they had forged together against all odds. Clara would carry that legacy into a world that might not fully understand it, a world of rigid categories and expectations that their valley had taught her to question. But she would carry it nonetheless, planting seeds of change wherever she went, just as Abigail and River had done in their own way. And in that knowledge, Abigail found not loss but hope. Hope for Clara, hope for the future, hope for a world that might someday learn what their family had discovered in this hidden valley. That the most beautiful things grow in the spaces between, in the fertile ground where differences meet and new possibilities take root. The years flowed like the creak through their valley, sometimes rushing, sometimes gentle, but always moving forward. Letters arrived regularly from Clara, each one a window into a world that seemed both foreign and fascinating to the family gathered around the kitchen table to hear Abigail read them aloud. Clara had thrived at Miss Harrington's school, her natural intelligence flourishing under proper guidance. She had indeed qualified for Oberlin College and was now in her second year there, studying mathematics and natural philosophy with a determination that made Abigail's heart swell with pride. Her letters spoke of lectures and experiments, of debates with fellow students, of ideas that would have been unimaginable in their isolated valley. But they also spoke of loneliness, of being caught between worlds, of never quite fitting in despite her best efforts to adapt. "They see only parts of me," she wrote in one particularly poignant passage, "never the whole. To some I am too educated for a woman, to others too frontier in my thinking. They cannot understand the life that shaped me, and I find I will not deny it simply to make them comfortable." James, now 18, had grown into a young man who combined River's quiet strength with his own distinctive intelligence. Unlike Clara, he had never yearned for formal education or life beyond the valley. Instead, he had become an integral part of their expanding homestead, developing an almost uncanny ability to breed and train horses that were sought after by settlers and indigenous peoples alike. His gift had transformed their isolated home into a destination of sorts, a place where those seeking the finest mounts in the territory would journey regardless of the difficulty. Through James's work, their valley had become known not as a strange outpost of mixed-blood outcasts, but as the source of horses of unparalleled quality and temperament. Emma, at 15, remained the family's bridge builder, connecting their homestead to the small community that had developed around them, forging friendships with both the mixed heritage families who had settled nearby and the occasional new arrivals who found their way to the valley. She had her mother's gift for teaching and had begun helping the younger children in their growing settlement, establishing a small school in a cabin built specifically for that purpose. For Abigail, now in her mid-40s with strands of silver threading through her auburn hair, these years had brought a satisfaction she could never have imagined when she lay dying in the snow 2 decades earlier. The lines around her eyes spoke of both laughter and squinting into distant horizons. Her hands bore the honest calluses of a life built through determination and hard work. River, whose dark hair now carried its own silver streaks, moved with the same fluid grace that had first. He caught her attention, though occasional stiffness in his joints on cold mornings reminded them both that time marched onward. Their partnership had deepened into something beyond conventional marriage, a union of equals who had created something extraordinary from the ashes of their separate losses. It was River who first spotted the rider approaching from the eastern, ridge one crisp autumn afternoon, a solitary figure on horseback moving with confidence through terrain that typically challenged newcomers. He shaded his eyes against the setting sun, his posture suddenly alert. "Clara," he said simply, the name carrying all the emotion he rarely displayed. Abigail hurried to his side, her heart quickening. "Are you certain? We weren't expecting her until spring." But River was already striding toward the corral, whistling for James. Emma, returning from her schoolhouse, heard the commotion and came running, her face alight with excitement. "Clara's coming. Today." Within minutes, James had saddled 2 horses, and he and River were riding out to meet the approaching figure, while Abigail and Emma hastened to prepare the homestead for their unexpected visitor. As they worked, Emma sweeping the cabin floor while Abigail put together a meal worthy of a homecoming, Abigail found herself wondering what had prompted Clara's unannounced return. Her most recent letters had been full of her studies, mentioning a promising position as a teacher's assistant that might lead to further opportunities. There had been no indication of dissatisfaction, no hint that she planned to abandon the path she had worked so hard to establish. Yet, as the riders drew closer, and Abigail stepped onto the porch to watch their approach, she knew immediately that something significant had changed. Clara sat tall in the saddle, but there was a new maturity in her bearing, a certainty that went beyond the confidence she had always possessed. Beside her rode River and James, both wearing expressions of barely contained surprise. As they reached the yard, Clara dismounted with fluid grace, standing for a moment as if to reacquaint herself with the feel of her childhood home beneath her feet. She wore a practical traveling outfit, a divided riding skirt and jacket that spoke of Eastern tailoring but frontier practicality, and her hair was arranged in a simple braid down her back. "Clara!" Emma cried, flying down the steps to embrace her sister. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" Clara returned the embrace warmly, her eyes seeking Abigail over Emma's shoulder. "Some news is better delivered in person," she said, her voice carrying a new resonance. Abigail descended the steps more slowly, drinking in the sight of her firstborn, the daughter she had carried through snow and desperation, who had been the catalyst for every choice that followed. "Welcome home," she said softly, opening her arms. As Clara stepped into her embrace, Abigail felt the subtle changes in her daughter, the new confidence in her posture, the sense of purpose that radiated from her like heat from a banked fire. "I've missed you," Clara whispered, holding tight for a moment before stepping back. "All of you, more than I knew was possible." Later, after the initial flurry of greetings and exclamations had settled into a more measured celebration, the family gathered around the familiar kitchen table. River had built all those years ago. The lamp cast a golden glow over their faces as they shared the meal Abigail had prepared, filling Clara in on the valley's news, while tactfully waiting for her to reveal the purpose behind her unexpected return. Finally, as Emma cleared the dishes and James poured coffee into the cups their neighbor Mrs. Whitehorse had traded for one of his colts, Clara straightened her shoulders. "I have something to tell you," she began, her hands clasped before her on the table. "Actually, several things." She took a deep breath. "I've completed my studies at Oberlin, finished early with honors." "Clara, that's wonderful," Abigail exclaimed, "but your letters mentioned nothing about early completion." "I wanted to surprise you," Clara explained with a smile, "but that's not all." She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document, placing it on the table. With deliberate care, "I've been offered a position at the new Territorial College in Denver, teaching mathematics." River leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Denver," he repeated. "Not so far." "No," Clara agreed, her eyes shining. "Not far at all. Close enough to visit regularly. Close enough to—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Close enough to come home." Abigail felt a tightness in her chest ease, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. "You're coming back to stay?" "Not exactly," Clara clarified. "I'll need to live in Denver during the school terms. But I want to build something here, in the valley, a place of my own but connected to all of you." James, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "But why give up the opportunities back east? I thought that's what you wanted, to be part of that world." Clara considered her brother's question carefully. "I learned something important these past years," she said. "That world, the one with universities and lecture halls and published papers, it has much to offer. Knowledge, advancement, ideas that can change how we understand everything around us." She gestured toward the window, where darkness had fallen over their valley. "But it's incomplete without this world too. The one you've all built here." She unfolded the document she had placed on the table, revealing it to be an official-looking certificate. "This valley has always existed between worlds, not fully white, not fully Indian, something new and undefined. I believe that's its greatest strength. Her voice grew more passionate. I want to build a school here, not just for children, but for anyone seeking knowledge outside traditional boundaries, a place where different ways of understanding can meet and strengthen each other. Emma's eyes widened. Like my little schoolhouse? Much bigger, Clara confirmed with a fond smile for her sister. A proper academy eventually, one that honors both formal education and the practical wisdom that exists in places like this. She looked directly at River. One that values different cultures equally, instead of demanding that one submit to the other. River's expression remained impassive, but Abigail could see the emotion in his eyes. Ambitious plan, he said simply. I had ambitious parents, Clara replied, reaching across the table to take his hand and Abigail's. Who taught me that the most important boundaries are the ones we choose for ourselves? Abigail recognized her own words, spoken to Clara before her departure years earlier, now returned with new meaning and purpose. The territory approve such a school? She asked, practical concerns rising despite her excitement. Clara's smile turned slightly mischievous, a reminder of the determined child she had once been. The territory is desperate for educational institutions to attract civilized settlers. They'll approve it, especially with the backing of respected academics from the East. She squeezed their hands. They don't need to understand exactly what kind of education we'll be providing. As the evening deepened into night, plans unfolded around the table, where the school might be built, how it could serve not just their small community, but eventually draw students from across the territories, how Clara's position in Denver could provide legitimacy and connections, while the valley itself would offer something entirely unique. Later, when James and Emma had finally gone to bed, still buzzing with excitement about their sister's vision, Abigail and River walked with Clara beneath a sky blazing with stars. The air carried the crispness of approaching winter, but the cold couldn't touch the warmth that filled Abigail as she watched her daughter, now fully a woman, survey the valley with a planner's eye. You never expected this, did you? Clara asked softly. When you found yourself cast out in the snow? Abigail shook her head. I expected to die, she admitted. Nothing more. And instead, you built all of this. Clara gestured around them, at the homestead, at the scattered lights of neighboring cabins, at the peaceful valley that had sheltered them all. You carved a space between worlds where something new could grow. River, who had been listening silently, spoke with uncharacteristic emotion. Circle completes itself, he said. What began with survival becomes something more. Legacy. As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, Abigail felt the threads of past, present, and future weaving themselves into a pattern of extraordinary beauty and meaning. From that desperate day when River had found her in the snow, a pregnant widow abandoned by her own people, to this moment of watching her daughter prepare to build something visionary and bold upon the foundation they had laid. The journey had never been easy. There had been hardships, prejudices, wounds both physical and spiritual that had tested their resolve. But standing here now, surrounded by the family they had created and the community that had grown around them, Abigail knew with bone-deep certainty that every step had been worthwhile. Whatever comes next, she said softly, we face it together, as we always have. Clara smiled, her face illuminated by starlight, the silver locket Abigail had given her still hanging at her throat after all these years. Not just survival, she agreed, echoing River's sentiment, but a new beginning. And in that moment, as autumn leaves danced on the night breeze and the distant mountains stood sentinel around their valley, Abigail felt the story come full circle. From Abandonment to belonging, from desperation to hope, from mere existence to a life of profound meaning and purpose, not just for herself, but for generations yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.